He hired a father and son for a pittance to restore his burned-down mansion. He thought it would be cheap work, but when they started tearing up the floor, the house revealed a secret he had been trying to hide. Subscribe to the channel and write which city you are watching from. The road narrowed into a single strip of gravel that wound between overgrown hedges and fields that had long surrendered to weeds. Dust rose behind the old pickup as it rattled toward the horizon, its engine humming in weary rhythm with the summer air. Inside, Michael Turner kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, scanning the uneven road. His son, Ethan, sat beside him with his elbow propped on the open window, letting the warm wind lift his hair and the scent of dry grass fill the cab. The boy's gaze kept drifting toward the distant silhouette rising beyond the trees. A house blackened by time and flame, its roof collapsed, its chimneys like broken teeth against the sky. They had been driving since dawn. The contract had come through only a week ago, an offer too good to ignore, though too uncertain to trust. A realtor from the city had bought the burned-down mansion for almost nothing and was now looking for workers willing to restore it enough for sale. The words had sounded casual over the phone, but Michael had known what they meant. Patch the cracks, paint over the scars, make it look alive just long enough to fool a buyer. Still, he'd accepted. Honest work was scarce, and his debts had grown like ivy. He stole a glance at his son. 14, eager, full of questions he didn't always ask. Ethan was spending his school break working with him for the first time, determined to prove he could do more than carry tools. For Michael, it was a chance to teach him something real about labor, patience, and the way a man's hands could shape the world even when no one noticed. "Is that it?" Ethan asked, pointing ahead. Michael nodded. "That's it." The house loomed at the end of the lane like a wounded animal. Once it must have been magnificent stone columns, wide windows, and a veranda that faced the valley. Now the columns were cracked, their surfaces streaked with black soot. The windows were hollow sockets, and the veranda sagged as though bowing to the weight of memory. Even from the truck, they could smell the faint, acrid trace of old smoke. A silver sedan stood near the gates, gleaming like a coin dropped into mud. A man leaned against it, checking his watch with irritation. When Michael parked, the man straightened, buttoning his jacket though the heat was rising. "Mr. Turner?" he said, extending a manicured hand. "Richard Hayden. We spoke on the phone." Michael wiped his palm on his jeans before shaking it. The grip was firm but perfunctory, a gesture of business, not of welcome. "This your boy?" Hayden asked, glancing toward Ethan, who had stepped out and was staring at the house with wide eyes. "My son, yes. He's helping me for the summer." Hayden smiled thinly. "Good to learn early. Hands-on experience builds character." Ethan didn't answer. He was studying the black streaks running up the stone walls, the gaping holes where windows once were. He imagined laughter once echoing there, carriages rolling up the path, lights shining through the glass. Now everything stood silent. Hayden opened a folder and flipped through pages, explaining the project with the precision of someone who saw the house only as numbers and deadlines. "I need the place cleared, reinforced, and visually restored," he said. "No need for a full renovation. Just make it look habitable. Paint, plaster, cover the damage where you can. We're selling the image, not the history." Michael felt a knot tighten in his chest, but kept his voice calm. "Understood. We'll do what we can." "I'm sure you will," Hayden replied, handing him a set of keys. "I'll be back in a week to check progress. Finish early, and there'll be a bonus. Fall behind, and I'll find someone else." He smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. Moments later, his sedan purred down the drive, leaving behind a shimmer of heat and the faint scent of cologne that didn't belong among ashes. For a long moment, neither father nor son spoke. The house towered before them, a skeleton of grandeur and grief. Ethan kicked at a pebble. "He doesn't like this place," he said quietly. Michael bent to pick up a piece of charred wood. "He doesn't have to," he said. "He just wants to sell it." "Do you like it?" Michael studied the walls, the heavy beams, the way the sunlight filtered through the shattered windows. "It's broken," he said. "But it's still standing. That counts for something." They spent the rest of the morning unloading tools and supplies. The air inside the mansion was thick with dust. Every step sent up small clouds that caught the light from the open doorway. The floors were warped, the ceilings blistered. In some rooms, vines had already crept through cracks, curling like green veins against blackened walls. Ethan followed his father through the ruins, shining his flashlight into corners. "Do you think someone died here?" he asked suddenly. Michael paused. "Maybe. Fires don't ask permission." The boy's light swept over what had once been a fireplace. Ash lay thick inside, gray and undisturbed. He knelt to touch it, but his father's hand stopped him. "Don't. It's still toxic." They worked in silence for hours. Michael pried loose beams, swept debris into piles, measured the damaged foundation. Ethan gathered nails and brushed soot from the stairs. The rhythm of labor filled the air. Hammer, scrape, breathe, repeat. At sunset, they sat outside by a small fire, eating sandwiches from their cooler. The sky burned orange behind the silhouette of the house. "It feels alive," Ethan said, watching the windows catch the fading light. "Like it's waiting for something." Michael smiled faintly. Every house waits. Some for people to come back, some for someone to let them go. The wind shifted, carrying the faint creak of a loosened shutter. For a moment, the sound was almost human. A long, tired sigh. They stayed on the property that night, sleeping in their truck. At dawn, the work began again. The days blurred into a steady rhythm of effort and exhaustion. Ethan learned quickly, moving with growing confidence. His hands blistered, but he didn't complain. He watched how his father measured twice before cutting once, how he inspected every joint before nailing it. The man's patience fascinated him. His silence taught more than words. A week later, Hayden returned. He arrived in a pressed suit despite the heat, his shoes unsullied by dust. He glanced around with thinly veiled impatience. "You're moving slow," he said. "Buyers won't pay for sentimental stories." Michael straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We're making sure it's safe. The beams near the staircase were close to collapsing." Hayden shrugged. "Just make it look good. It doesn't have to be safe if no one's living here yet." Ethan's head snapped up. "That's not right," he said before he could stop himself. The Realtor turned to him, one brow raised. "What's not right, son?" "You can't sell something broken," the boy said quietly. Hayden laughed once. "You'd be surprised what people buy." After he left, silence settled again. Michael sat on the steps of the veranda, rubbing his hands together. Ethan stood beside him, angry and helpless. "He talks like it's all just money," the boy muttered. "It is to him," Michael said. "To us, it's work. To him, it's numbers." That night, they worked longer than usual, determined to prove themselves. The air grew cooler, the smell of wet soil drifting in through the broken windows. Michael was pulling out a section of scorched flooring when Ethan's voice cut through the quiet. "Dad," he said. "Listen." Michael paused. The boy tapped his boot against one of the floorboards. A hollow echo answered. He frowned, crouching down. Strange. The space beneath shouldn't sound empty. Maybe it's just rotted. Maybe, Michael said. But his curiosity stirred. He struck the edge lightly with the handle of his hammer. The sound was dull, metallic. Not wood on wood, something heavier. They set aside the tools and pried up the board carefully. Beneath the soot-blackened planks lay a glint of rusted metal. Ethan crouched closer, his breath caught in his throat. "It's a box," he whispered. Michael brushed away the debris. The object was small but solid, half buried under ash and fragments of charred wood. Its hinges were fused with rust, its surface etched with the marks of fire. The two of them stared at it in silence. The light from their lamp flickered across the dull metal, reflecting faintly in the boy's wide eyes. Michael exhaled slowly. "Looks like this house still has secrets." Ethan's voice trembled between fear and wonder. "Do you think it's treasure?" His father didn't answer. He could feel the weight of the thing, not just in his hands, but in the air itself, as though the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to find what it had hidden. He set the box aside carefully and looked around the darkened room, its charred walls whispering in the wind. Then, in a quiet voice that neither of them quite understood, he said, "Maybe some things burn, but they don't die." The lamp flickered again, and for a heartbeat, it seemed the shadows around them shifted, like the house itself had turned its gaze toward them, finally awake. Morning broke pale and cool, the first light spilling through the gaps in the broken roof and landing across the blackened floorboards. The box still sat where they had left it the night before, its rusted surface faintly glimmering under a thin veil of dust. Ethan was the first to wake. He slipped quietly from the sleeping bag in the corner, careful not to disturb his father, and crouched beside the find that had haunted his dreams all night. He brushed a hand along the lid, tracing the rough metal with his fingertips. It was cold to the touch, though the air around it felt strangely still, as if time itself had stopped there. He didn't dare open it alone. When Michael stirred, he saw the boy crouched beside the object, his eyes shining with the mix of excitement and fear that only children could hold so purely. The man sat up, stretching the stiffness from his back. "You didn't sleep much," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "I couldn't stop thinking about what's inside." Michael looked at the box for a long time. He had found old things before, a cache of silver spoons behind a plaster wall, a photograph folded inside a beam, but nothing like this. Something about the weight of it, the way the floor had swallowed it for decades, felt different. They cleared the debris away, working wordlessly, until the box lay fully exposed. Its edges were scorched, the hinges fused together. Michael took a crowbar from his toolkit, wedged it beneath the lid, and pressed. Metal groaned, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty room. A puff of ancient dust rose into the air. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth, were small bundles of paper, 2 velvet pouches, and a few scattered coins dulled by time but unmistakably gold. Ethan gasped. His father reached in carefully, lifting one of the pouches. It was light, the drawstring frayed. When he loosened it, several coins fell into his palm, catching the weak morning light. They were old foreign, perhaps, stamped with faces and words that neither could recognize. Beneath them lay letters, folded and tied together with faded twine. Michael picked up the top one, hesitating before opening it. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, written with deliberate care. He read aloud, slowly. "If this house should fall, may the hands that lift it from ruin find what I have hidden, not as payment, but as faith in their labor. Let the house live again, and those who give it life share in what remains of mine." Ethan leaned closer. "It's like he was talking to us," he whispered. Michael folded the letter and placed it back inside the box. He wanted to feel the thrill his son did, but a heavier emotion rose in him instead. A man's words from the past, Speaking of trust, of reward, it wasn't treasure. It was burden. The right thing was clear to him, even if it wasn't easy. He ran a hand over his face, smearing soot across his skin. "We'll call Mr. Hayden," he said finally. Ethan's head snapped up. "Why? Because this house belongs to him. We're just here to fix it." "But Dad, he doesn't care about this place. You heard him. He just wants to sell it." "That doesn't make it ours." The boy's voice grew sharper. "You said we're the ones keeping it alive. That letter, he said whoever lifts it from ruin should have it. That's us, not Hayden." Michael sighed. "I said we're fixing it. That's all. The rest belongs to whoever owns the deed. We do the work, we get paid, and that's where it ends." Ethan looked down at the coins glittering faintly inside the box, his hands curled into fists. "He's not the kind of man who deserves this," he muttered. "Deserving's not up to us," Michael said quietly. When he stepped outside to make the call, the sun was rising over the field, turning the ash-stained walls a softer gray. Hayden answered on the second ring, his voice brisk and impatient. Michael explained what they had found, an old box beneath the floor, containing letters, jewelry, and what looked like gold coins. The realtor's tone shifted instantly. "You didn't touch it, did you?" "Just to make sure it wasn't something dangerous." "I'll be there in an hour," Hayden said, and hung up before Michael could say another word. Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression dark. "He didn't even say thank you." Michael pocketed his phone. "Doesn't matter. We'll hand it over and be done." An hour later, the realtor's car crunched up the gravel drive. He climbed out quickly, dressed as if for a meeting in the city, rather than a visit to a ruin. His eyes darted to the box the moment he stepped inside. "That's it?" he asked. Without waiting for permission, he knelt and opened the lid. His breath caught for just a moment before he composed himself. He picked up one of the coins, turned it between his fingers, and smiled. Well, you never know what you'll find in old houses." Ethan watched from across the room, arms crossed. Hayden stood, brushing off his hands. "Good work, both of you. I'll take this for safekeeping. Historical property and all that. I'll file a report later." Michael frowned. "Shouldn't the authorities handle it? There might be legal—" "I'll handle it," Hayden interrupted. "You've done enough, actually." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Given the schedule, I think it's best to end your contract here. I'll have another crew finish up. I'll send partial payment next week." Ethan's voice cracked. "You're firing us?" Hayden looked at him like he was swatting a fly. "I'm making adjustments. Happens all the time. You've been paid fairly for your time." Michael's jaw tightened, but he forced his tone to remain even. "We had an agreement, and now it's changed." The realtor smiled without warmth. "Good day, Mr. Turner." He lifted the box and carried it out as though it weighed nothing. The sound of his car faded down the road until there was only the wind again. Ethan turned on his father, his face flushed. "You're just letting him take it? He stole from us." Michael sat down heavily on the steps, rubbing his temples. "It's not worth a fight we can't win." "You said honesty matters. Does it still matter when someone uses it to crush you?" The man didn't answer. He looked out across the field, the sunlight striking the blackened windows, and for the first time in years, he felt old. That night, they stayed again in the house, though neither could sleep. The walls creaked in the dark, the wind sighing through the gaps in the roof. Ethan sat by the cold hearth, staring at the space where the box had been. "He didn't even say thank you," he whispered again. Michael sat nearby, silent. After a while, the boy spoke again, his voice low. "I took pictures," he said. Michael looked up. "What?" "When we found it. Before he came. I wanted to remember." He pulled out his phone and showed the images, grainy but clear enough. The box half buried in ash, the coins inside, the letter spread open with the lines visible. Michael squinted at the words, reading the same sentence again. Let the hands that lift it from ruin find what I have hidden. For a moment, the weight of what they'd done pressed on him. The letter had spoken of faith in labor, of trust in those who built rather than owned. He remembered Hayden's careless tone, his polished shoes stepping over dust and charred wood. Something inside him shifted, something stubborn and quiet. In the following days, they stayed on the site, finishing what little they could. Hayden hadn't sent anyone else yet. Maybe he'd forgotten them. Maybe he didn't care. The pay never arrived. They ate canned food, their supplies running thin. Still, Michael couldn't bring himself to leave. He worked slower now, more deliberately, as if searching for something buried deeper than nails or beams. One afternoon, while he was reinforcing a wall, Ethan called out from another room. "Dad, come here!" The urgency in his voice made Michael drop his hammer and hurry over. The boy stood near the same corner where they had found the first box, his face pale but determined. He tapped a board near the far wall. "Listen." Michael crouched and knocked. The echo was there again, hollow, but softer this time, like air moving through a small space. Together they pried the plank loose. Beneath it was a smaller cavity, and inside, another box thinner, made of tin, sealed with wax. Michael's hands trembled as he lifted it out. He broke the seal, and inside were a few folded pages wrapped in a sheet of oilskin. The handwriting was the same. He read silently at first, then aloud. "This house is not to be claimed by purchase, nor by deceit. It belongs to those who restore it with their own hands, who mend its wounds and remember its name. To them, I entrust what remains. Let no man of profit steal what was built with faith." The words hit like a blow. Michael sat back, the letter trembling in his hand. Ethan watched him, waiting. "You see," the boy said softly, "he meant us." Michael didn't answer at once. He folded the paper carefully and set it aside, his mind racing. If the first find had been a matter of honesty, this was something else proof. Proof of intent, maybe even of ownership. He thought of Hayden's arrogance, of the way he'd waved them off like hired dirt. For the first time in years, anger rose in him, not loud but steady, burning slow like coal. That evening, he made a call to an old friend, someone who worked in the city clerk's office, a man who'd once shared a construction site with him back in the early days. He explained carefully about the house, the box, the letter. The man promised to check the records. 2 days later, the call came back. The property's sale had not yet been finalized. Hayden's paperwork was incomplete, submitted under a shell company that didn't technically exist. If the original family's deed was still valid, ownership could revert, or at least the discovery could void Hayden's claim. Michael thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence. Ethan came in from outside, carrying firewood. "What's wrong?" Michael smiled faintly. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything." They spent that night sitting by the dying embers of their fire, the letter between them on the floor. Ethan spoke quietly. "Do you think the man who wrote that, do you think he knew someone like Hayden would come one day?" Michael looked toward the ceiling, where the stars peeked through the broken boards. "Maybe he knew people don't change much. Some build, some take. The house doesn't care who owns it. It remembers who saved it." The boy nodded slowly, his eyes heavy with sleep. Before dawn, Michael rose. He walked through the silent halls, touching the walls that had stood through fire and greed, and now carried the breath of new life. He felt the weight of what he had to do, not for gold, not even for justice, but for something older than both. Outside, the fields shimmered with dew. The house behind him stood quiet, its windows dark. But to him, it felt awake again, listening. He knew that tomorrow he would face Hayden once more. Not as a worker asking for pay, but as a man defending something that had finally chosen him. And as the first light crept over the roof, Michael understood what his son had been trying to tell him since the start. The letter hadn't been about reward. It had been about inheritance, the kind that can't be bought, only earned. The kind written not in ink, but in the sweat and truth of those who rebuild what others would destroy. The morning came heavy with mist. The fields around the old mansion were blanketed in silver fog, and the outlines of the burned chimneys rose like dark pillars against the whitening sky. Michael had been awake long before sunrise. He sat on the front steps with a thermos of coffee that had long gone cold, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the road that led to the gate. The call had been made the night before. Richard Hayden had agreed to meet him at noon to settle accounts, as the man put it. That was exactly what Michael wanted, an end, one way or another. Inside, Ethan moved quietly, gathering tools and stacking them near the doorway. The boy had grown harder these last few weeks, older in ways his father hadn't intended. There was less impatience now in his movements, more gravity. When he came out, the fog clung to his clothes, and he stood beside Michael in silence. "Will he come?" Ethan asked after a long while. "Oh, he'll come," Michael said, rubbing his hands together. "He can't stand the thought of unfinished business." Ethan glanced at his father's face. There was a stillness there that unsettled him, a calm too steady to be peace. "What are you going to do?" Michael didn't answer immediately. The fog was thinning, revealing the shape of the house behind them. Repaired beams, new boards fitted against old charred walls, the faint scent of linseed oil still hanging in the air. It looked less like a ruin now, more like something waking from a long sleep. He turned to his son. "We're not going to do anything wrong. We're going to tell the truth, that's all." The sound of an engine broke the silence. Hayden's sleek sedan emerged through the fog, headlights slicing the damp air. He parked with a confidence that grated against the quiet dignity of the place, stepped out, and slammed the door as if to remind the earth who owned it. He was smiling again, that same businessman smile polished to perfection. "Mr. Turner," he said smoothly, walking up the drive. "I hope this means we can end things on good terms. I've been quite busy with buyers lately." Michael stood. "We will end them," he said. Hayden looked around, noting the piles of lumber, the tools neatly lined up, the progress on the house. "You've been working even after I dismissed you. Admirable dedication, though I can't promise compensation for unauthorized labor." Ethan stepped forward, unable to hold back. "You fired us so you could steal what we found." Hayden's expression flickered but quickly recovered. "Ah, the young man still has a vivid imagination." "I didn't steal anything, son. The contents of that box were part of the property, and by law—" "They weren't yours to take," Michael interrupted quietly. His tone was low, but carried a finality that silenced even the Realtor for a heartbeat. Before Hayden could respond, the sound of another vehicle drifted through the fog. It was a city van, white and official-looking. Behind it came a second car, a dark blue sedan. From it stepped a man in a tan coat and two others, carrying briefcases. Michael recognized one of them immediately, his old friend from the clerk's office, now wearing a badge clipped to his pocket. "Mr. Hayden," the man said, approaching with the crisp voice of someone used to authority. "We received your request for a meeting about the restoration project. Convenient timing, as there are a few irregularities regarding the deed we need to discuss." Hayden's composure slipped. "Irregularities? That's absurd. My company processed all paperwork legally." "Your company?" the man asked, flipping through a folder. "Interesting. According to our records, Northridge Investments, was dissolved 3 years ago. The documents used in this purchase were filed under that entity. Hayden's jaw tightened. There must be some mistake. Michael watched without speaking. He didn't need to. The house itself seemed to breathe around them, its quiet presence more commanding than any accusation. The clerk continued. In addition, we've reviewed statements and evidence provided by Mr. Turner regarding items found during restoration. Photographs, letters, dated materials, all indicating that the property's previous owner left specific written intent regarding possession of any buried contents. He held up a sealed envelope. We've verified this document's authenticity with a handwriting expert. It explicitly transfers those assets to whoever restores the house with their own hands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Hayden's face drained of color. That's ridiculous, he managed. You can't assign ownership through a century-old letter. Perhaps not entirely, the clerk said, but you can certainly lose it through fraud. And it appears you have. Ethan watched, hardly breathing. The boy's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had dreamed of justice, imagined it as something loud and triumphant. But now that it was here, it came like a whisper. Quiet, inevitable, dignified. Hayden tried to speak again, but the words faltered. The officials conferred among themselves, then one of them turned to Michael. Mr. Turner, for now, the property will remain under municipal review until rightful ownership is re-established. However, based on the evidence, it's likely that restoration rights and any historical compensation will be credited to you and your team. Michael nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, his voice even. Hayden stepped forward, desperate now. You can't do this. That gold, those letters, they belong to me. I paid for this land. The clerk met his gaze coldly. You paid for an illusion. This house never truly belonged to you. The officials moved toward their vehicles, leaving Hayden standing in the driveway, his polished shoes sinking into damp earth. He looked smaller now, the fog curling around him like judgment. Then, without another word, he turned, got into his car, and drove away. For a long while, father and son stood in silence, watching the trail of dust disappear down the road. The fog had lifted completely by now, revealing the hills and the pale blue sweep of sky. The house behind them seemed to glow faintly in the sunlight, the charred wood gleaming dark and strong against the new boards. Ethan finally spoke. Is it over? Michael exhaled. For him, maybe. For us, it's just beginning. The weeks that followed moved differently, slower but full of meaning. News of the discovery spread through the small town. Local papers ran headlines about the hidden legacy of the Ashford house. The rightful heirs of the original owner were found a distant granddaughter, now living in another state. She came quietly, a gray-haired woman with gentle eyes, and a worn photograph of the house as it had been before the fire. When she met Michael and Ethan, she took their hands in both of hers and said, You didn't just rebuild walls, you brought it back to life. The legal process was long, but the result was just. The house returned to her family's name, and the heir insisted that Michael's company oversee its full restoration. The reward for the find was substantial more money than Michael had ever seen. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the recognition, the validation that honesty had not been foolish after all. He used part of the reward to buy new equipment, register his business under the name Turner Son Restoration, and rent a modest workshop in town. The sign above the door was simple, hand-painted by Ethan himself. They worked together every day, side by side, measuring, cutting, building. The rhythm of their labor had changed. It wasn't survival anymore. It was purpose. The house transformed gradually. New beams replaced the charred ones, but sections of the old wood remained, preserved like scars that told a story. The veranda was rebuilt, the windows reframed, the roof tiled in slate that caught the light like polished stone. Inside, they left one portion of the burned wall untouched, a memorial to what had been lost and to what endured. Sometimes, when they worked late, Michael would look up and see Ethan tracing the grain of the old boards, his face thoughtful. "Do you think the house remembers us?" the boy asked once. Michael smiled. "Houses don't forget the hands that heal them." When the restoration was finally complete, they stood outside on a crisp autumn evening, looking up at the facade now gleaming in the setting sun. The air smelled of sawdust and rain. The windows reflected the golden light, and for a moment, Michael could almost see the house as it must have been a century ago. Alive, proud, whole. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a single gold coin. It was one of the few left from the chest, polished and set in a small frame. He held it out to his father. "I kept this, not for the money, just as a reminder." Michael took it, turning it over in his palm. "A reminder of what?" "That we built something honest," Ethan said. "That even when people tried to take it, we didn't give up." Michael nodded. "Keep it then. Let it remind you that work like this, real work, outlasts greed every time." As the sun sank lower, the house glowed with a soft, amber light. It no longer looked haunted. The grass had grown back where the fire had once burned it to ash. The wind moved through the open windows with a gentle whisper that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. Later, after the air had departed and the house had been formally dedicated as a historical site, Michael and Ethan returned one last time. The rooms were empty now, echoing faintly with their footsteps. They walked through the hallway to the old parlor where they had first found the chest. The floorboards gleamed beneath the new varnish, but if you knelt and looked closely, you could still see the faint outline of the seams where they had pried the planks open. Michael ran his hand over the wood. "You know," he said softly, "when I first came here, I thought this job was just another paycheck. I didn't realize it was going to change everything." Ethan stood beside him. "The house chose us," he said simply. Michael looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting in a quiet smile. Maybe it did. Or maybe we chose to listen. They stood together in the fading light, father and son, builders who had unearthed not just gold, but a kind of truth that couldn't be buried again. Outside, the trees rustled gently, and the sky deepened to the color of old bronze. When they finally walked away, the house seemed to stand taller behind them, every beam and stone resonating with something that wasn't quite sound, but more like memory. Years later, people would pass by the restored mansion and marvel at its beauty. They would see the craftsmanship, the detail, the strength of the work, but no one would know how much of themselves the two men had left within those walls. They wouldn't know that beneath the polished floors, where fire once raged and greed once whispered, lay a foundation built on honesty, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of those who choose what's right over what's easy. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind moved just right across the valley, it seemed as if the house itself spoke. Wood creaking softly, beams settling, a language only those who built could understand. It was not a haunting, but a remembrance, a steady, living heartbeat. For the Turners, the story never truly ended. The workshop thrived, new houses rose, old ones were saved, and in each nail driven, each wall raised, there lingered the echo of that first lesson in the ruins of a burned estate. That true wealth lies not in what you find beneath the floor, but in what you build above it. And on the day they finished their final visit, as they closed the gate behind them, Ethan turned for one last look. The house stood bathed in gold, every window catching the dying light. "You were right," he said quietly. The house is alive again." Michael nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it remembers the hands that kept it honest." Together, they walked down the gravel road toward the horizon, leaving behind the house that no longer needed saving. It stood firm and silent, not as a relic of loss, but as proof of what endures when good men refuse to be bought. And in that silence, deep within its beams and bones, the house itself seemed to breathe steadily, proudly alive once more. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are so many more stories to discover. And share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.